This wasn't a normal animal attack. This was something different. Maddie sucked in a panicked breath. Whatever did this couldn't be far away. Hi, I'm author and teacher Sean C. McMurray, and it's time for a scary story. Maddie lived in a small cabin with her husband, Richard. They hadn't been married long, though they'd practically grown up together. The one thing they had in common, besides their obvious affection for one another, was their desire to get away from the town they were born and raised in. It wasn't the mountains, it was the fighting. Their two families had been locked in a generations-long feud over property rights. In the midst of it, somehow, these two had found each other. And like Romeo and Juliet, the two of them eloped before leaving for East Tennessee. But unlike Shakespeare's star-crossed lovers, Maddie hoped for a happy ending. Before she got it, however, she'd have to survive a terrifying ordeal. Maddie had planned out everything, down to the fresh wildflowers placed at the center of the table. Richard would come in from his long day at the textile factory, see her sitting there in her yellow dress, the one he liked the most. He'd smile through his exhaustion, and before he could even ask, she'd tell him the news. Maddie rubbed her belly, anticipating the moment. It would be perfect. If only she had something fancier than eggs and pancakes to celebrate with. But they didn't have much. After scrounging for any extra work he could find and saving for months, Richard had purchased a milk cow and half a dozen hens. His theory being that if things got tight, they would always have milk and eggs to eat. Well, things got tight, so eggs and pancakes would have to do. Maddie had just slipped on her apron and was about to start preparing dinner over the cook fire stove when she heard the family's two dogs start barking. Assuming the hounds had treed a squirrel, she didn't think much of it, but when they suddenly went quiet, that changed. Calling for them, she stepped out the front door onto their small porch. They didn't respond. A tinge of concern seeping into her belly, she went around to the back of the cabin. There she saw the door of their barn standing wide open. Hadn't she shut it? She couldn't remember. Hoping their milk cow Betsy hadn't wandered out, or worse, she hurried through the ankle-high grass into the barn. Maddie's heart sank. Betsy's stall was empty. Fortunately, there was no sign of animal attack, no blood or fur, so likely Betsy had just wandered off, probably in search of some tastier grass to graze on. That didn't explain the racket the dogs had made, and their sudden disappearance, though. And that unsettled Maddie. She told herself the dogs had probably just run off after a squirrel. They'd come home eventually. Betsy was a different story. If she was in the woods, she was in danger, and they couldn't afford to lose her. Maddie surveyed the terrain, trying to put herself in the mind of a hungry cow. Across the field was a path into the woods leading to a meadow. Perhaps Betsy smelled something on Maddie when she returned after picking wildflowers there earlier. Pulling at the skirt of her apron and dress, Maddie entered the woods. Immediately something fell off. Though the birds sang out and the cicadas joined the choir, their melody was different, unnerving in a way she couldn't quite pinpoint. Like looking at your reflection in a mirror and seeing something about your face you don't recognize. Nevertheless, Maddie pressed on, determined to find Betsy and get home in time to surprise Richard. Nearly halfway down the path, Maddie came upon something that gave her hope her theory was correct, but also filled her with trepidation. Her two hounds lay panting in the dirt, angled toward a thick patch of tall grass. It was obvious the tall grass had been parted by something. Maddie approached the dogs. They rose to all fours, but didn't greet her. Instead, they turned toward the parted grass and whimpered. "She's in there," Maddie said to him, "and I have to go get her." The dogs whimpered again, giving Maddie more than a moment of hesitation before she stepped past them and into the tall grass. The grass acted as a barrier of sorts. The woods were darker here, and noticeably cooler. Enough to cause goosebumps to sprout on Maddie's arms, though it couldn't all be blamed on the change in temperature. Twisting herself to avoid a tangle of thorns, Maddie descended a small slope, until finally, at the bottom, she found Betsy. Or what was left of her. The sight and smell of it was too much to bear. Maddie gagged. The milk cow had been torn to pieces, her mangled corpse lying in chunks across the forest floor. Tears filling her eyes, Maddie cursed herself for being so absent-minded. But her anger faded when the particular vicious way of Betsy's demise finally registered. This wasn't a normal animal attack. This was something different. Maddie sucked in a panicked breath. Whatever did this couldn't be far away. Trying not to make a sound, Maddie backed away from Betsy's remains, her senses attuned to any sudden movement. Nearly halfway up, Maddie caught the sound of crinkling underbrush nearby. She jerked herself around in time to see something like a shadow with green marble eyes pass between the trees behind her. She was young, but she knew enough to know she was now being hunted. Recalling a trick she learned from an old Cherokee woman, she untied her apron, the only article of clothing she had free with her, bundled it up, then threw it as high and as far as she could in the opposite direction. It landed midway up a tree, caught in the grasp of a dead branch. A second later, a high-pitched growl split the air, followed by the sound of claws tearing at tree bark. Wanting to gain as much distance between the creature and herself, Maddie scrambled up the slope, shoving her way through the bramble. Nearing the top of the slope, Maddie was suddenly yanked off her feet as her dress snagged in the tangle of thorns. Grating her teeth, she tugged at her dress in an attempt to get free. It was no use. Having no other choice, as she sensed the monster approaching, Maddie slithered her way out of her dress, then crawled up the remainder of the slope wearing only her undergarments. Her knees scraped and bleeding, her clothes stained, Maddie burst through the tall grass with the monster hot on her heels. At that moment, her two hounds found their courage and leaped into action. A vicious battle ensued, but Maddie didn't stick around to witness it. Instead, she pumped her arms and legs as hard as she could. Behind her, the brawl came to an end, and the monster continued its chase. Maddie could hear its paws pounding the earth with heavy thuds like rolling thunder, covering the distance between them with rapid speed. The cabin came into view, and Maddie zeroed in on the open door. She just had to reach it, for herself and for their growing family. Though her lungs burned, she urged herself forward, and upon reaching the front porch, lunged through the open door. She scrambled to her feet, slammed the door shut, and yanked the plank of wood they used as a lock down into place. A split second later, something heavy crashed into the door, the force of which knocking Maddie off her feet. Unleashing another high-pitched growl, the monster tore into the lumber. Maddie grabbed a large meat fork and stabbed a thick black paw just as it broke through a gap in the wood. The monster let out a terrible roar and retreated, but only for a moment. In that time, Maddie went to the stove and pulled a glowing hot metal poker out of the cook fire. And as the monster threw itself at the door, she plunged the poker into the gap in the wood. The monster unleashed another terrible cry, and this time retreated for good. Her face wet with a mixture of sweat and tears, Maddie sank to the floor, clutching the fire poker with both trembling hands. And that's where Richard found her, a short time later. After tearfully listening to what had happened, Richard comforted his wife, and they got a hunting party together. It took nearly half the night before the hunting party, along with 2 bloodied but alive hound dogs, found the creature and finished it off. What they brought back, and Maddie's face-off against it, became a thing of legend in those parts. With fur as black as coal and measuring over 9 feet from head to tail, Maddie had faced down a giant panther and somehow survived. The next morning, Maddie shared her good news with Richard over a breakfast of eggs and pancakes. The dogs got the meat. So black panthers are considered to be cryptids because most experts don't believe they actually exist. But there are stories like the one I just told you all over. If you have one, I'd love to hear it. Just leave it in the comments. If you like the story, you may like my 99-cent novella, The Lonely Living. It's available on Amazon. Check out my other stories I have posted here as well. And don't forget to like and subscribe and tell others about this channel. Thank you guys for watching. God bless.